Okay, welcome again. The speaker tonight is George Young, and I told him before when we started planning this event, I put some pressure, added pressure on him by telling him that his would be the grand finale of the seminar series. So I think he'll live up to the task, I'm sure. George Young, I've known him for a number of years now since he came to work at UNE. He has got an undergraduate degree in English from Duke and a PhD in Slavic languages and literatures from Yale University. He is the author of the Standard Critical Biography of Nikolai Fedorov in 1979, a biography of the American marine artist Charles Woodbury in 1998, articles on Russian literature and religious thought and the history in general, and academic periodicals, chapters in edited books on Russian literature and philosophy, and the history of Western esotericism, both in English and in Russian, most recently in Esotericism, Art, and Imagination from Michigan State University Press, and in a collection of essays on Russian cosmism published by the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. He is currently working on a book on Russian cosmism. For many years, he owned and operated a fine arts auction business specializing in early European and American paintings. He has taught at Grinnell College and Dartmouth College, and since 2003 in the English department at UNE. So please help me in welcoming George Young.
Before I start my remarks, I'd like to invite you to join me in expressing a little bit of gratitude to Anwar for all that he has done in preparing, in organizing, in carrying out this series of lectures and this program, this center that's going to be a dynamic and I think very fruitful center for intellectual activity here at the university and in southern Maine. So just a round of applause for Anwar, please. Here's the book by James Billington, Russia in Search of Itself. Maybe some of you are familiar with an earlier major work that Billington did, very thick, The Icon and the Axe, which is a brilliant book, and many other things that he has written about Russia and about just history in general. So if you haven't had a chance to get through the book yet, I'd certainly recommend it. It is a wonderful little summary of what has been going on since the fall of the Soviet Union. And so this evening, I'll be focusing in some detail on one of the many intellectual tendencies that James Billington mentions in post-Soviet Russia, the tendency called Russian cosmism. I can't talk about all the things in the book, but I would like to focus a little bit on one of these tendencies that he discusses, in which the Russians look back to their recent past in order to see forward into the distant future. But before that, if you'll allow me, I'd like to say a little bit about how I got interested in Russian. Unlike many of my colleagues in Russian studies around the country, I don't have any Russian family background, never knew any Russians, or heard any Russian spoken in the small town in Indiana where I grew up. And probably like most Americans at that time, I didn't know much of anything about Russia, just that it was huge and in the hot war had been our ally, but in the Cold War was now our rival, and its people were supposed to be unhappy. But to me, it was just too far from everything I was interested in to pay much attention to. But on October 4th, 1957, all that changed. Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite, precipitated throughout the country, and especially in our 11th grade science class, a real crisis. As anyone here in the auditorium, and I see a few old enough to remember that time, will tell you, instead of a great achievement for humanity, it was viewed more or less as a poke in the eye for America. It was a jolt. This wasn't supposed to happen. We were supposed to be the #1 in science and technology and everything else. But there it was, You could see in pictures of it on your black and white TV, and if you had a friend with a ham radio, you could listen to its steady, annoying beep, 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 beep. And over the next months, every time we Americans tried to put something into space, our rocket would get 6 inches off the ground and then flop over on its side in a huge cloud of white smoke. And meanwhile, the Russians were putting up not just a little 83.6 kilogram Sputnik 1, but some huge thing that weighed tons, and it even had a dog in it. So this was the first surprise lesson I learned about Russia, that they had been able to accomplish something grand that we were supposed to be able to do better, but hadn't yet accomplished. So that October, I decided that I had to do what any bright, patriotic, hardworking young person should do to help America regain its lost honor and prestige. I was going to be a rocket scientist. So a couple of years later, as a freshman in college, I had to decide what language to sign up for. Colleges then still had a 2-year foreign language requirement. I didn't want to repeat the Latin or Spanish or little French I'd had in high school, so I was thinking about German, since so many great scientists did speak German. But my roommate Tom suggested Russian. He was going to be president of the United States and thought it would be a good thing to be able to speak to his opposite number in the Kremlin in Russian. And for the same reason, it would be good for me to be able to communicate directly with my opposite numbers in rocket science. In all this, Tom was very persuasive, so we both signed up for Russian 1. Tom dropped out after the second weekly quiz, but I stuck with it. And as the year went on, I found that while rocket science was indeed a great subject, some of us are better suited to other disciplines. I developed a love for all literatures, American, English, French, German, Greek, and Latin, but especially Russian. And that was my second surprise discovery about Russia, that in addition to launching the first artificial satellite and the first dog and the first man, Yuri Gagarin, and remember that name because we'll be hearing more from him, launching into space, they had also turned out one after another of the world's greatest literary works. By the time I had gotten through all of the Brothers Karamazov and the first 950 pages of War and Peace, I was hooked for life. Then, as Pushkin says, the years walked by. And the next thing I knew, I was teaching Russian language and literature at a small college in Iowa. And by the way, I was using for historical background an early work by who was then a brilliant young scholar named James Billington, when one morning I opened the New York Times and couldn't believe my eyes. There on the front page was a picture of my old freshman roommate, Tom, under the headline, Peace Corps Volunteer Jailed in Russia. And every day or so, for weeks, that was one of the stories, if not on the front page, at least in the front section. Senator demands release. President demands release. Mother wants son returned. This was 1966, in the middle of the Cold War, each side spying on the other by land, sea, and air, every consulate and embassy chandelier triple bugged, diplomats semi-annually nabbed and expelled, and Tom, despite having forsaken Russian, had somehow stumbled in. As he later told me, he was serving in a northern Iran village, in a village up near the Caspian Sea, and one day went out for a long solitary walk along the beach. He was in a kind of meditative state, just strolling, looking at seashells, vaguely wondering what he was going to do after the Peace Corps, not paying much attention to anything, sort of like when you're driving along and don't notice that you've gone past your exit. Then suddenly soldiers were pointing their Kalashnikovs at him and yelling strange words that somehow reminded him of those dreaded 8 a.m. drills in freshman Russian. In the first 2 weeks of Russian class, even if you pay close attention, you don't learn much that you can use in a situation like this. But Tom remembered "Это карандаш," this is a pencil. And "Это книга," this is a book, and not much more. But even though he didn't have anything in his hands, he said those words again, anyway, again and again, "Это карандаш," "Это книга," as they hauled him away. He says the soldiers were actually pretty good guys, amused, friendly, and realizing without too much mental strain that this particular Western imperialist who kept repeating "et de Carandash" would not be a serious threat to the motherland. But it was the Cold War, and he had illegally, if obliviously, strayed across an unmarked border. Week after week dragged on, and Tom said it was very interesting that each new cellmate they brought in with him was even friendlier and spoke even better English than the previous one. Finally, President Johnson traded a real spy for Tom, no doubt one of the usual cultural attachés rounded up in one of the periodic sweeps of the Soviet staff at the UN. So here was a third surprising lesson, that life is strange, and things you think you've forgotten about can suddenly come back, and you never know. Something you consider to be absolutely useless knowledge, some et de Carandash from the irrelevant humanities, may come in handy someday and help you through an unanticipated, sticky situation. So more years walked by, and the Cold War, which claimed my freshman roommate Tom as a temporary victim, gradually came to an end, starting in the mid-1980s with Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring, and concluding with the failed coup of August 1991, in which Boris Yeltsin stood atop a tank in front of the White House in Moscow, and with the support of the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, rallied the army and people against the hardline back to communism coup leaders. The collapse of the Soviet Union was greeted with cheers and high fives in the West. The so-called evil empire had fallen, the Communist Party was outlawed, the muzzles were taken off the press and media, the archives were opened, the crimes of the Stalinist era could now be investigated. State industries were privatized, and it seemed that the long-suffering Russian people were finally going to enjoy the freedom and prosperity that Americans and Western Europeans had long taken for granted, and that other Eastern Europeans, in what had formerly been called the Iron Curtain countries, were beginning to share. We Americans had always known that the main thing all people all over the world want is an open, free market society just like ours, and that the collapse of the communist dictatorship would allow the Russians now to become our partners in a new world order free from ideological conflict. But it just didn't turn out that way. Despite all the Harvard MBA advisors and economic blueprints, despite multi-party elections, despite Pepsi and McDonald's, and lessons in how to make just the right size beef patty and French fry, how to smile brightly and chirp the Russian equivalent of "have a nice day," despite all that, Russia was not to become the 51st state of our union. Now, nearly 20 years after the fall of the USSR, Western commentators voice alarm at the prospect of a return to dictatorship in Russia, and view with nostalgia the heady early days of glasnost and perestroika, regretting that such a promising start has lost all momentum, and that under the leadership of Putin and Medvedev, an ominous outcome seems certain. But, and here's another surprise lesson, in Russia, the view has been, for the most part, the opposite of ours. Gorbachev, they say, a darling of the West, brought not perestroika, but katastroika. Putin is not curtailing important freedoms, but restoring order. Our kind of leader, they say, our nash in Russian, tough, strict, willing to do whatever is necessary to clean up corruption, put down the exploitive oligarchs, and restore the international clout that their Ich Gorbachev piddled away. They love to contrast our, the nash in Russian, and their, meaning our Western Ich. Even if it stinks or doesn't work right, if it's nash, it's still better than Ich. So in polls, Putin consistently still earns an approximately 80% rating of highly favorable. And as for nash Stalin, a popular line of thought runs that to be sure he showed no mercy to his enemies, but maybe they deserved it. And under his leadership, the Soviet Union became a superpower, and with only negligible help from the West, crushed fascism in the Great Patriotic War. As Putin remarked in a speech last year, no one wants to go back to the terrible times of the 30s, quote, but other countries have also known their bleak and terrible moments. In any event, we have never used nuclear weapons against civilians, and we have never dumped chemicals on thousands of kilometers of land or dropped more bombs on a tiny country than were dropped during the entire Second World War, as was the case in Vietnam, unquote. In a 2008 poll to name the most important figures in Russian history, Stalin placed third, behind Alexander Nevsky, the 13th century warrior saint who defeated the Teutonic Knights, and Pyotr Stolypin, a hard-nosed pre-revolutionary prime minister who imposed painful but salutary agricultural reforms and cracked down hard on leftist revolutionaries. Placing lower than Stalin were such figures as Lenin, Pushkin, Tolstoy, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and the first man in space, remember, Yuri Gagarin. After communism then, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, the Baltic states, Georgia, Bulgaria, even Romania, all began to rejoin what the Soviets used to call the imperialist sphere, and American Cold Warriors finally called the free world. Why not Russia? As Billington shows us, Sovietologists have suggested all kinds of reasons. Too little help from outside, too much help from outside, lack of free market experience, excessive exploitation of the free market environment, perennial internal incompetence and corruption, an outside conspiracy to prevent Russian success, that everything changed too slowly or changed too fast. All that's probably true, but as a literary person, I prefer the view of the 19th century poet Fyodor Tyutchev. Russia cannot be grasped by the mind, nor by the common arshin can she be measured. Her dimensions are of a special kind. Russia can only be believed in, treasured. In America, when we talk about what makes us so special, we usually talk about the American dream, the idea that by hard work, any individual from any background or starting point can achieve a better, richer, and happier life, if not always for himself or herself, at least for the children and grandchildren. The Russian equivalent is not the Russian dream, but Russkaya dusha, the Russian soul, not what you can make of yourself or do for your descendants, so much as what you are and always have been and will be, with all attractions, all warts and bulges, all contradictions. Forgive me if you've heard me say this before, but a good way to translate Russkaya dusha is, I am miserable sinner, world is terrible, life unbearable, and how I love her. Life being feminine in Russia. A fuller and more scholarly definition enumerating all the contradictions comes from the early 20th century philosopher, a cosmist, Nikolai Berdyaev, in his book, The Russian Idea. Quote from it, there is that in the Russian soul which corresponds to the immensity, the vagueness, the infinitude of the Russian land. Spiritual geography corresponds with physical. Two contradictory principles lay at the foundation of the structure of the Russian soul. The one, a natural, Dionysian, elemental paganism, and the other, ascetic, monastic orthodoxy. The mutually contradictory properties of the Russian people may be set out thus. Despotism, the hypertrophy of the state, and on the other hand, anarchism and license. Cruelty, a disposition to violence, and again, kindliness, humanity, and gentleness. A belief in rites and ceremonies, but also a quest for truth and justice. Individualism, a heightened consciousness of personality, together with an impersonal collectivism. Nationalism, laudation of self, and universalism, the ideal of the universal man. An eschatological messianic spirit of religion, and a devotion which finds its expression in externals. A search for God and a militant godlessness, humility and arrogance, slavery and revolt, but never has Russia been bourgeois until now. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russian intellectuals in their contradictory manner, while sipping at Starbucks and checking their tweet lines, argue vigorously and eloquently about the best way into a future that is not theirs, but ours, nash, Russian. Neither the communist ideal of the worker's paradise, which they now regard as a foreign import, nor the Western ideal of bourgeois comfort, big house, big car, good teeth, and good plumbing, but something Russian, something grand, a spiritual dimension corresponding to the geographical, something all-deciding, full of impossibilities and contradictions, all or nothing, some version of paradise on earth. In Russia in Search of Itself, James Billington makes the important point that the major intellectual and political tendencies in post-Soviet Russia are not static but fluid, that authoritarians and democrats share much ground, sometimes switch sides, and often have closer friends in the opposition than within their own movements. Russian intellectual life is very much an individual and social dialectic, swinging from this position to that, shuttling between opposites, then trying to find a resolution that is not a compromise, but a totality that comprehends all opposed principles. One of the intellectual movements which Billington devotes some pages to, but which I would like to discuss in more detail, is the tendency called Russian cosmism. We've heard little about it in the West, but in Russia now there's a flood of books, articles, conferences, lectures, dissertations, even university and high school courses, and middle school curricula on cosmism and the cosmos. Of the dozens, perhaps scores of intellectual tendencies thriving in Russia today, cosmism is certainly one of the more important. So who are they, and what makes their ideas so attractive to Russians today? First, the cosmists are big thinkers. They have a worldview that attempts to comprehend all humanity, all time, all space, all science, art, and religion. And not only is their view big, it is totalitarian in the strict sense that it must apply to all without exception. The big idea, of course, will not be applied by force or compulsion, but will be so attractive and convincing that all will freely and voluntarily accept it. Second, the cosmists are very Russian, tending even toward Russian nationalism. The adjective they use a lot is отечественный, patriotic or fatherlandish, but with a Russian, not the Latin flavor that patriotic has in English. It's the word used in what we call World War II, but they call the Great Fatherland War. The cosmist thinkers would be peripheral in the modern Western philosophical tradition with its rationalist or empiricist principles, its narrowing into specialized interests and emphasis on epistemology. But in the Russian God-seeking but human-centered philosophical tradition, emphasizing the existential, the historiosophic, and the eschatological, the cosmists are smack in the mainstream. The idea is that Russian will lead the way to a new spiritual ideal. That idea is central to all of Russian philosophy or philosophizing, as Billington suggests. Third, and connected to the previous, the cosmists are at least slightly, sometimes even more than slightly, anti-Western. To the cosmists, the intellectual culture of the West is isolated, individualistic, uninformed, negative, divisive, centerless, and death-bound. Western popular culture is simply barbaric. Cosmism should be propagated as vigorously as possible, in part to keep Russia Russian and save her from the Western intellectual and popular pollution. Fourth, the cosmists were banned during the Soviet period. Their works could not be published, and the thinkers themselves were either forced into emigration or sent to the Gulag, where they were executed or died from starvation or hard labor. After the fall of communism, the writings that had been most strenuously prohibited naturally became the most immediately appealing. So the hidden trunks and secret drawers began to open, manuscripts hidden or ignored for 30, 40, even 100 years appeared again, fresh and new. This rediscovery of their very rich recent past has become a major part of the Russian vision of the distant future, so that thinkers who seemed out of step with their own time are now considered perfectly in step with ours and with the times that will come after ours. Fifth, many of the cosmists were polymaths, not only interested in, but highly competent in 2, 3, or half a dozen specialized disciplines. philosopher, artist, natural scientist, theologian. Individually and collectively, they covered all the bases. Most were highly recognized in at least one recognizable field. So their cosmic speculations, even if they must seem unorthodox at best, crazy at worst, carried at least the possibility of legitimacy. Sixth, like much Russian religious and spiritual writing, cosmism has a profoundly mystical, occult, esoteric dimension. A study of Russian publications in the 1990s found that some 39% of all nonfiction books published in Russia in that decade had something to do with the occult. And a trip through any large bookstore in Russia today would probably produce a similar, if not even a larger, unofficial tally. The combination of occult or semi-occult speculation, but with the possibility of academic or intellectual legitimacy, accounts for some of the appeal of cosmism. Cosmism provides a forum for serious consideration of such topics as active human-directed evolution, the alchemical realization of the higher self, the attainment of human immortality, the restoration of life to the dead, the control over time, and the influence of cosmic energies on human behavior. The term I use for cosmism is exoteric thaumaturgy, wonder-working in an intellectually respectable form. Seventh, the cosmists offer far-sighted and carefully considered answers to the most frequently asked question in Russian intellectual history, "Что делать?" What is to be done? In their discussions of what is the matter with the world, the cosmists are less original and reflect or anticipate analyses of Marxists, Freudians, environmentalists, and others, and thus today their analyses of what's the matter sound more familiar than shocking. It is in proposing what is to be done about it all that they show how far out of the box their thinking has ranged. Eighth, even in the face of formidable challenges and in no way turning aside from the problems to be faced, the cosmists offer hope that humanity will prevail. Despite the odds, they remain optimistic and do not succumb to what they see as Western doom and gloom. They convey the traditional Russian sense that no matter how bad things may look at the moment, no matter how mighty Genghis Khan, Napoleon, Hitler, or any other enemy, human or non-human, appears, Russia, and under its leadership humanity, will come through. And again, the idea of the Russian soul. Life can be terrible, but how I love her. Who were these cosmist thinkers? Most of the names will be unfamiliar, so I'll put them on the screen as we go along. One of the early ones was Alexander Soukova-Kobylan, a fabulously wealthy aristocratic playwright, accused and arrested, but later acquitted of the murder of his French mistress. The notorious, protracted, scandalous court case embittered him for life, but inspired the works that constitute his literary legacy: Krushinsky's Wedding, The Case, and The Death of Tarelkin, a savage comic trilogy satirizing greed and corruption that still plays to appreciative audiences in Russia. Only his enormous wealth, he argued, attracted the false accusations against him, and only the bribes that wealth enabled him to pay secured his acquittal. After his ordeal, he withdrew entirely from his previously active role in Russian high society and devoted himself to translating and explicating Hegel and to developing his own eccentric philosophy. He posits three stages in the development of humanity: telluric or earthbound man confined to the planet we inhabit, solar man inhabiting our solar system, and sidereal man inhabiting all worlds throughout the entire universe. Only the third stage, sidereal, of humanity has the absolute freedom that is the goal and perfection of all human movement and development. Important steps in the process of turning ourselves from earthbound human animals into sidereal human angels include becoming vegetarians, developing lighter and smaller rather than more massive bodies, and gradually acquiring the ability to fly. And flight for Soukova-Kobylan does not mean merely the invention of flying machines, but the growth of wings and attainment of the bird-like, insect-like skill of aerial self-propulsion. Humanity in its present telluric stage is too much a captive of gravity and the senses. He writes, quote, "If God is spirit and spirit spaceless, then man approaching God should consume his spaciousness, i.e., reduce his body, and by this reduction of the body become more and more spiritual, i.e., free himself from the burden and fetters of space. We see this in the animal world in the form of flying insects, who, owing precisely to their reduced size, i.e., their proximity to spirit, are wonderfully mobile. A fly in 1 second flies over approximately 100 times its own length. If a man could attain that same degree of physical freedom which a fly has attained, he could move with great speed 100 times his length, race almost 200 meters in 1 second, i.e., move through space with the velocity of a cannonball, unquote. In our self-directed evolution, then, according to Sukhova-Kabilin, the further we evolve, the smaller our bodies should become. And as we approach divinity, we will also approach a vanishing point of spaceless invisibility. God is invisible, and we shall also become invisible, essentially bodiless, as we approach the goal of perfect, spiritualized, universal humanity. So, those of us who are not very tall can take at least a little comfort in representing the Sukhova-Kabilian higher man. To mention him again, Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, was 5'2". And now to an earlier Gagarin. The original and most important figure in the Cosmos movement was Nikolai Fyodorovich Fyodorov. He was born in the south of Russia, the illegitimate son of Prince Pavel Gagarin from one of Russia's oldest and most prominent families, and a neighboring woman about whom almost nothing is known. As he wrote much later, one of his first childhood memories was the constant awareness that he was both a member and not a member of an illustrious Russian family, a Gagarin and not a Gagarin. He always chose to speak and write from the point of view of the outsider addressing insiders, someone with intimate knowledge of both the highest and lowest strata of Russian life, a voice for the voiceless. His major essay is titled, quote, "The Question of Brotherhood or Kinship, of the Reasons for the Unbrotherly, Unkindred, i.e. unpeaceful state of the world, and of the Means for the Restoration of Kinship, a note from the unlearned to the learned, clergy and laity, believers and unbelievers," end quote. Following Sir Isaiah Berlin's famous division of thinkers into foxes, who know many things, and hedgehogs, who know one big thing, Fyodorov was a supreme hedgehog. The one big thing he knew is that all problems known to man have a single root in the problem of death, and no solution to any social, economic, political, or philosophical problem will prove adequate until humanity has solved the problem of death. But if a solution to the problem of death can be found, then solutions to any and all other problems will fall into line. Nature, for Fyodorov, is the force of disintegration and death. Everything that begins as a whole unit, whether social, spiritual, or physical, macrocosm or microcosm, animal, vegetable, or mineral, is driven by nature to separate into particles. What he calls the common task of humanity is to restore wholeness and integrity to whatever nature disintegrates, whether on a cosmic, a social, or a personal scale. Death for the individual is the disintegration of the person into particles. He calls those particles ancestral dust. And the task for humanity is to unite in a universal project that enlists all peoples, all faiths and unfaiths, all forms of knowledge and action together toward the one goal of regathering all the dispersed particles of ancestral dust, no matter where on Earth or beyond Earth those particles have drifted, restoring life to all humans who have ever lived and died, starting with recently departed relatives and gradually with sons and daughters resurrecting their parents, who in turn resurrect their parents over many generations, resurrecting all the way back to Adam and Eve. The restoration of life to all dead ancestors is the one task, he writes, that can let us understand that we are all truly, literally related, that can unite all mankind, all religions, all branches of knowledge, art, and activity. Nothing short of this will suffice. Already in the late 19th century, Fyodorov included in his project, and was ridiculed for it, such then unthinkable ideas as cloning, genetic engineering, space travel, and eventually the reconstitution of human organisms to live on sunlight and air and to survive throughout the universe in places currently unable to support human life. For Fyodorov, a devout Orthodox Christian, the project of resurrection would solve the problem of divisiveness and enmity among religious creeds. By participating in the act of resurrecting their ancestors, everyone would be following Christ indeed, actively, truly Christian, regardless of creed or upbringing. The attainment of individual immortality by itself, the goal of the Nietzschean Superman in Fyodorov's day, whom Fyodorov calls the eternal adolescent, is the height of immaturity and immorality. For we must regard ourselves first and foremost not as men and women, but as sons and daughters of men and women. Christ came not as man or God, but as Son of Man and Son of God. So the vertical Christian idea of sonship and daughterhood must precede the horizontal ideals of brotherhood and sisterhood, whether French revolutionary fraternité or Marxist comradeship. Immortality is acceptable only if it is universal, extending back through all time as well as throughout space. Human love, to be unselfish, must be directed toward those from whom we took life. Present life is spiritual cannibalism, the young devouring the old. Future life must reverse that direction and give life back to those whose lives fed us. The ultimate goal is the restoration of paradise, not only on earth, but throughout the cosmos. We will rearrange matter, Fyodorov says, to suit God's intent, no longer being idle passengers, but will become, and he said this in the 1860s, captain and crew of spaceship Earth, guiding it from its natural orbit into orbits that embody throughout the universe God's intent, a cosmic icon of the Holy Trinity. After we have changed the world as it is into the world as it ought to be, there will be no more childbirth, as well as no more death, no marriage, no sex, no competition for love and admiration, no enmity, no war, no cheeseburgers. We will enjoy practical interpersonal omniscience. Everyone who ever lived will be alive again. So all human memory and consciousness will be ours to call on. If we wish to know, for example, how and why Stonehenge was built, we can simply ask the people who built it. All knowledge will not be divided and subdivided into narrow rival academic specialties, will not be the province of a special educated elite, but will be integrated, active, and shared by all. Fyodorov says that a most serious difficulty that must be solved is the complex problem of nourishment and waste, or as he puts it, the problem of cannibalism. He writes that we cannot condemn cannibalism among primitive peoples because, quote, at the present time we are living on the account of our ancestors, from whose dust we derive our food and clothing. Thus all history may be divided into two periods, a first period of direct, immediate cannibalism, and a second period of covert people-eating, which continues to this day, and which will continue as long as man does not find a way out of his imprisonment on earth. But after this second period, a third must necessarily follow, a period of universal resurrection as the single effective expiation for the sin of cannibalism, unquote. For Fyodorov, only a radical restructuring of our world and of ourselves, he calls it regulation of nature, will free us from generational cannibalism. If to achieve immortality means that we will continue to live more or less as we do now, only without dying, then in Fyodorov's view, we will only be as immoral as we are immortal. Heaven or hell will be of our own making, and so long as we allow ourselves to be driven by nature, we are hell-bound. But simply tinkering with ourselves and our universe without the only true goal will not do. Technological advance without accompanying spiritual advance will only hasten our destruction. Only if we follow, as he says, the icon of Christ, Son of God and Son of Man, resurrector of Lazarus and resurrected from Golgotha, can we recreate ourselves and our universe into the paradise that has forever been the dream of humanity, and avoid a monstrous, lurching, Frankensteinian existence in a botched, fixer-upper universe. For Fyodorov and the later biocosmos, a future goal of humankind should be autotrophy, taking nourishment from sun and air, as now practiced in rudimentary form by certain plants and bacteria. Not in the immediate future, but perhaps in far distant times, we may need fewer and fewer parts of the body we now feed, and eventually become more like mentally and spiritually advanced plants, communicating in rich mind fields, than like advanced primates, leaping faster and higher in increasingly expensive footwear. We could eventually be enormous, interconnected sensibilities with a minimal physical presence. The hardly imaginable technology necessary for the radical transformations that Fyodorov's project would require caused even his most devoted friends to shake their heads and smile. Tolstoy, who is seated in the chair in the front, who considered himself proud to have lived at the same time as such a man as Fyodorov, could not resist raising his eyebrows in skeptical amusement when he spoke of Fyodorov with visitors. And Vladimir Solovyov, who is in the back there, who wrote to Fyodorov that, quote, "Since the time of the appearance of Christianity, your project is the first forward movement of the human spirit along the path of Christ. For my part, I can only regard you as my teacher and spiritual father," unquote. Solovyov was horrified at the scientific technological side of the idea and tried to convince Fyodorov that resurrecting must be an entirely spiritual activity, utilizing prayer, fasting, meditation, and other spiritual exercises to first develop immortal souls, and then to let those souls create appropriate new bodies, but not to attempt to revive corpses. Solovyov has long been considered Russia's most important philosopher, but only in recent years has it become evident how much his work was influenced by and partly a reaction against Fyodorov. Essentially, Solovyov offers a smoother, clearer, more moderate and systematic, less Russocentric development of several major Fyodorovian themes. For Solovyov, the great goal of human life should still be universal resurrection and total unity, but this is to be accomplished via the attainment of God-manhood, through the mystical embrace of divine Sophia. The great difference is in emphasis. Where Fyodorov spoke mainly of the God of the Fathers, the cult of the Fathers, the resurrection of the Fathers, Solovyov emphasizes the eternal feminine. Where Fyodorov talked of science, duty, labor, hardship, and abstention, Solovyov speaks of poetry, love, ecumenism, and the sublimation of eros. Space travel, genetic engineering, physical resuscitation, and the altering of natural orbits of planets just have no place in Solovyov's resurrection plan. One thing that Fyodorov insisted on is that our task is to labor to end any gap between ideal and reality. As mentioned above, one of his most radical ideas was that of autotrophy, self-nourishment, allowing one to abstain from any and all eating, or as he termed it, from cannibalism. In life, Fyodorov was never able to actually practice autotrophy, but he probably came as close as anyone west of the Ganges could. Tolstoy, who from midlife on struggled with everything of the flesh, regarded Fyodorov with amazement and perhaps envy for the chaste, abstemious life he was able to live without apparent effort. Even though he shared some of the general thrust but not the details of Fyodorov's idea, in the end, Tolstoy always seemed more impressed that Fyodorov ate only hard rolls, stale cheese, now and then an onion or other raw, nutritious root vegetable, and drank only dark tea, and that he wore the same shabby coat winter and summer, managed to donate most of even his very meager salary to the poor, and cursed himself if he came home at night with a few kopecks in his pocket. More impressed that Fyodorov slept on a humpbacked trunk without a bed or pillow than with the entire project of universal resurrection. The idea of a new age and an evolving new humanity that runs through the cosmist tradition and finds radical expression in Fyodorov's call to turn our present culture, which he calls pornocracy, with the sex drive at the root of absolutely everything, into a new age, which he calls psychocracy, with spirit at the center, finds further development in the 20th century in Vladimir Vernadsky's theory of the three stages of our planet's evolution, which began with the geosphere, inanimate life, which led to the biosphere, biological life, out of which is emerging the noosphere, from the Greek word nous, mind, in which the human cognition becomes an active agent of evolution. Trained as a mineralogist, Vernadsky, like many others of the cosmos, was a polymath, the founder of the sciences of geochemistry, biogeochemistry, and radiogeology. In his seminal book, The Biosphere, he hypothesizes that it is life that has made Earth what it is, and in his later writings, he suggests that human intelligence is in the process of transforming the Earth into what it will be, a transformation that will be as fundamental and momentous as the earlier transformation from a mineral to a biological entity. Not all who knew of Fyodor's boldest ideas during his lifetime ridiculed him. In 1873, Fyodorov took under his wing a 16-year-old raw youth from the provinces who had come to the library for self-education. This young man was Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who later became the pioneer of Soviet rocket science, and in addition to several mathematical and scientific papers, wrote Fyodorovian fantasies and theosophical treatises on panpsychism and man's future in a cosmos in which every atom is not only alive, but sentient. It was Tsiolkovsky's mathematical formulas, inspired by Fyodorov, an unrecognized Gagarin, that laid the groundwork for the first Sputnik in 1957 and for the first flight into space by Yuri, the most famous name in the long and distinguished Gagarin line. Another important cosmist was Alexander Chizhevsky, the internationally honored heliobiologist whose best-known work is on the influence of the 11-year solar cycles upon human mass behavior. Since at least the time of the ancient Babylonians, astrologers have plotted the supposed influence of celestial bodies upon human affairs. Chizhevsky made this influence a topic for serious scientific investigation and found plausible correlations between cyclical variations of solar energy and wars, revolutions, and other mass outbreaks of human violence. Just as Tsiolkovsky had studied under Fyodorov's inspiration and direction, Chizhevsky lived and worked with Tsiolkovsky in Kaluga, a small city in central Russia that has the kind of esoteric associations and reputation of a place like Glastonbury, England, Sedona, Arizona, or Roswell, New Mexico. It is a place of pilgrimage for New Age Russians, a major center for Russian theosophy early in the 20th century, and home of the joint Tsiolkovsky-Chizhevsky Museum for Space and Cosmobiology today. Two other major thinkers who developed the spiritual rather than the scientific side of cosmism, following Solovyov more than Fyodorov, were the theologians Sergei Bulgakov and Pavel Florensky. Both were Marxists in their youth, but as they both later wrote, outgrew their youthful, shallow materialism to find previously unsuspected spiritual depths in Russian Orthodoxy. Both became priests. Bulgakov, earlier recognized as a brilliant Marxist economist, provided a sociological spiritual equivalent of Fyodorovian regulation of society, which he called a philosophy of economy. Now recognized as a thinker whose proposals for spiritual economy could, as one recent book suggests, quote, serve as a linchpin connecting the communal economic ethic of Islamic societies with the individualistic ethic of democratic capitalism, unquote. Bulgakov in his own time was rejected by both Marxists and the Orthodox Church. Along with Nikolai Berdyaev and 160 other leading intellectuals, many of whom made contributions to the Russian religious renaissance of the early 20th century, Bulgakov was put on the so-called philosopher's ship of 1922 and permanently expelled from the Soviet Union. At the same time, the church formally accused him of heresy for his writings on Divine Sophia, a charge which he successfully refuted. And he was able to spend his last years as head of the great Orthodox seminary in Paris a center for creative Orthodox theology. Florinsky, who's in white, Bulgakov's close friend, a mathematician, occultist, aesthetician, electrical engineer, priest, mystic, and theologian, often called the Russian Leonardo, was not so fortunate. He continued to wear his priest cassock well after the revolution, and in characteristic Russian contradictory manner, became an active supporter of the Soviet transformation of Russia, teaching mathematics to workers while wearing his cassock, and supervising electrification projects in the hinterlands, while at the same time writing seminal works on the mystic significance of holy names, the hidden meaning of Russian icons, and one of the greatest classics of Orthodox spirituality, The Pillar and Ground of the Truth. His concept of a pneumatosphere, the sphere of spirit, was a continuation of Vernadsky's noosphere, and a prefiguration of Yuri Lotman's influential concept of the semiosphere, sphere of symbols and signs of the 1970s and 80s. One of the specific problems that Florinsky devoted significant attention to was of the relationship between the signifier and the signified, suggesting, for example, that figures in the old Russian icons are two-way windows, allowing believers to move from the real to the more real, and divine power to move from the more real into our real world. The idea of the wonder-working icons that have an effect on our life. Despite his active support of government policies, and despite his recognized standing as a mathematician and scientist, which saved cosmos thinkers like Tsiolkovsky, Chizhevsky, and Vernadsky, Florinsky was arrested, the stated reason being a paper that he had written about the theory of relativity, arguing that the geometry of imaginary numbers presented by Einstein's theory of relativity for a body moving faster than light is the geometry of what they call the kingdom of God. For that, he was sent to a labor camp in the farthest north, where he still made important studies of iodine, of life beneath the permafrost, and made significant archaeological discoveries about pre-Russian inhabitants of the Arctic. He was released for a time, then arrested again, and in 1937 he was sentenced to death and quickly taken out and shot. Another cosmist who tried to continue to work within the Soviet system was Valerian Muravyov, a diplomat and descendant of a long line of distinguished public servants. Well-traveled and educated in Western European schools, Muravyov, despite his initial monarchist and anti-Bolshevik leanings, became useful to the Soviet government in its early struggles, mainly because of his fluency in several languages, his overall respectable background, and a close acquaintanceship with Leon Trotsky. Like many young intellectuals from the upper nobility, he quickly abandoned his anti-Bolshevik prejudices and became an enthusiastic supporter of the revolution. As he discovered only too soon, his idea of revolution and the revolution that actually emerged were just too different. Muravyov wanted a total alchemical transformation of the individual and the cosmos. While working on various assigned Soviet projects, he wrote and published at his own expense a remarkable little book called Control Over Time, in which he proposes steps leading to the elimination of minute-by-minute temporality and the permanent realization of an eternal present. Time is not a universal reality, but a human construct, and by restructuring humanity, we can restructure and overcome time, he says. In a brief autobiographical sketch, Muravyov writes that he had passed through stages of interest in religion, religious heresies, Pythagoreanism, Neoplatonism, Freemasonry, Theosophy, and the ideas of the Illuminati before finding his real calling, working through Soviet agencies for the betterment of the people. Despite this apparently sincere declaration, and despite, or perhaps because of, his close relationship with Trotsky, he was arrested as an enemy of the people in 1929, sent to work in a meteorological station in the far north, and died of typhus in 1931 or 1932. Many other cosmists from early in the 20th century are worth talking about, but I'll briefly mention only one more, Vasily Kuprevich. a major Belarusian biologist, botanist, and longtime head of the Belarusian Academy of Sciences, has made important studies of the problem of longevity in microorganisms, plants, animals, and humans. He notes that certain plants that have been alive for 10,000 to 12,000 years, and posits that there is no absolute limit to the human lifespan. Death, he suggests, has not always existed, but is an historical phenomenon needed in earlier eras for evolution, the death of the old giving birth to the new. But now humans have reached a stage where death is no longer necessary for change and development. Kuprevich is confident that in the future, science will discover how human cells can renew themselves indefinitely, and death will no longer be built into human life. Today's leading cosmist is Svetlana Semyonova, a literary scholar and philosopher, a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences, editor of Fyodorov's collected works, author of major works on Fyodorov and the cosmist movement, and vigorous defender of cosmist ideas against all critics. And there have been many critics. One has denounced cosmism as scientific mysticism, another as technocratic pseudo-religion, and a third as the occult shadow ideology of Soviet Marxism. Semyonova, however, argues that once the excesses and outdated features are removed, cosmism offers today's best answers to the world's major problems. She contrasts the cosmist view, which calls for rational human regulation of the environment, to the views of those she calls the eco-sophists, who idolize the natural environment to excess and fear that any human attempt to shape, guide, or alter nature will inevitably lead to catastrophe. In the eco-sophist view, man is just another part of great nature, whose role is no more important or unimportant than that of any other living creature, animal, or vegetable. But Semyonova, along with Fyodorov and the other cosmists, argues that human reason endows us with greater abilities and responsibilities than other living organisms, and that we have a special role in the evolution of our planet, and indeed in the evolution of the cosmos. She argues that the evidence for this lies in the universally recognized phenomenon of cephalization, the evolutionary trend whereby nervous tissue over many generations becomes concentrated toward one end of an organism. Eventually, this process produces a head region with sensory organs, and eventually beyond that, a brain. This evolutionary process, through eons of time, has always moved in only one direction, never backward. To Semyonova, this is enough to show that in evolution there is and always has been a direction and a purpose. I don't think she uses the Russian word for design. I don't think, as a literary person who never got beyond the first college year in rocket or any other science, I find her idea has a certain beauty and appeal. And while I wouldn't argue that the Russian cosmists have the final answer to all the world's major problems, I do think that the moral, social, spiritual, and perhaps even scientific dimensions of their thought are worth looking into, both as an example of the kinds of things the Russians are seriously considering in their search for a new direction, and as a probing into matters that will be even more important for everyone in the future than they are today. And this brings me to the last surprising lesson about the Russians, that perhaps they have looked even further into problems of major consequence for the future than any other group of intellectuals, either in Russia or here in the West. For Fyodorov and the cosmists began at least 150 years ago to ponder and probe deeply into matters whose significance is only now beginning to be apparent. The question of just where technological advance is taking us, and just where it should take us, has never seemed so urgent as now. The degree to which we can and should have control over death is no longer a theoretical question. Courts of law, for example, are being asked to decide whether the life of a person in a coma is to be prolonged indefinitely or cut short, and whether terminally ill people in severe pain do or do not have a right to terminate their lives. The advance of technology has put us face to face with moral problems that formerly might have seemed inconceivable. And this may be merely the beginning. The question of whether, and if so, toward what end, we should attempt to alter the natural structure of organisms, including ourselves, is another problem that can only become more important in the future. All accounts of recent scientific developments written for people like me indicate that we are now on the threshold of a new age in which it will be possible for us to restructure, if not actually to create, life itself. Just what we should do with this godlike power is a question that someone is going to have to answer. And most urgently, how can all of us on earth not only recognize intellectually, but actually put into practice the idea that we are all one family, past, present, and future, that our differences in political parties, ethnicities, religions, ideologies, and sexual identities are small things indeed in the vast bends and stretches of the multiverse. The cosmos answers may not be the best ones that will ever be proposed, but perhaps their attempts to probe far and deeply into problems of increasing urgency will inspire someone, whether in Moscow or in Portland or in Biddeford, to look even deeper and farther. Thank you for your attention. I'll welcome any questions or comments, arguments, counter-arguments that you have, either about the remarks that I made or about Billington's book, which I didn't really get into a whole lot, but I'll be glad to address any of the things that you'd like to raise with regard to Billington's book as well.
And before we start asking questions, I just want to remind you we have a reception at the art gallery following the question and answer session. So you'll have more opportunities to talk to the speaker.
David.
Thank you. That was a trip. What were these guys smoking?
Yeah.
To my mind, we've got a lot of starkly irrational stuff going on in this movement, and I wonder if there's if it is taken sufficiently seriously in Russia for there to be critique of it.
Definitely, definitely. They publish a kind of a big, thick book called Cosmism Pro and Contra that is a continuing series. And so people, I'm one of the editors of that. And so people send in comments, pro and contra. They mine the past for attitudes toward or critiques of, certainly of cosmism. But as you say, there's certainly a lot of irrationality. And that's why I tend to view it more as an exercise in imagination, literary. I'm a literary person, and so I enjoy it from that angle. And as I present something like this, there are often two ways of presenting something that scholars make a distinction: the emic and the etic ways. The emic is where you try to put yourself into the framework itself, and without criticizing it or interpreting it from an outside framework, you present it as accurately and as fully as you can. And the etic is where you do take an outside framework to discuss something, whether it's maybe a feminist framework for looking at Homer or a Freudian framework for looking at Dostoevsky or something. You take an outside framework to look at something that you're discussing that may or may not reflect your own ideas. But when you take the emic approach, which I did in this talk and I do in my writing about the cosmos, it's to go inside their minds and try to present all the contradictions that I see and contradictions from within the framework itself. So that's what I was trying to do. But you're right, irrational. But it's part of what the Russians consider to be their virtue as much as their weakness, is the idea of contradictions and of something higher than rationality that runs through all of what Billington calls Russian philosophizing instead of Russian philosophy.
I enjoyed your presentation because I feel I agree with you that the Russian efforts and accomplishments aren't as highlighted as other groups, and it definitely made me more aware of big accomplishments and categories that they're very skilled and have much expertise in. And that was interesting, and it definitely persuaded me to be more interested in their culture.
Thank you. Yeah, that's one of the things that I think we get out of studying any foreign culture, whether it's Russian or Arabic or whatever, is
I just feel like a lot of the history that's been drilled in my head since I was young in school really highlights I would say probably Spanish, French, and it's really interesting that I just feel way more aware just from this one presentation versus all those years of history class.
Thank you.
Great.
Hi, George. I just had a question. What's the state of Russian literature in the post-Soviet era? Who are the big writers, and what are the topics being written about?
There are as many different schools of literature, almost, as there are schools of thought in Billington's account. He gives a whole spectrum of nonfiction writing, from the monarchists who are still active today, to fascist, to communist, the whole spectrum. The same is true of literature. You have some very lyrical writers who pay no attention at all, and deliberately pay no attention at all, to political conditions in Russia or in the world, but who are just pure lyricists. And you have people from all fields. There's a special group of writers who became more prominent in the 70s and 80s, continuing into the 90s, and now they're getting to be old men and women, called the village writers, who left the urban society and turned their backs on all official Soviet ideology and began to write about the villages, the people in the villages, the simple people, that kind of thing. Those are among the better Russian writers. There are a couple of guys who came to the United States, and one of them, his name is Edward Limonov, and he wrote a novel in English, and then it went back and wrote it in Russian, but he was a dissident for a while who came to the United States and got heavily involved in the drug and crime culture, and then went back and got involved in the Russian crime and drug culture. But he's a novelist, a very talented writer as well. So he writes crime stories from the point of view of the criminal. There are some great detective story writers in Russia, spy stories. Then there's women's literature. A phenomenon that has occurred recently that maybe you've heard about is a writer. It's supposed to be nonfiction, but you can't believe that it's nonfiction. The so-called Anastasia of the Ringing Cedars series. And it's about a businessman in Siberia who, wandering out in the woods one day, came upon this beautiful young woman, unbelievably beautiful young woman, who was simply dressed just in a smock of some kind, and she was from an earlier Vedic civilization. Never had been to school, totally untutored, but she was brilliant, and she knew all things. So anyway, he gets to be initiated by her into the life of the earth, and she gets initiated by him into something more of contemporary life. But it's sort of like Don Juan, the Yaqui way of knowledge, but in Russia, through a woman instead of through an old wizard. So that kind of thing that is It's enormously popular. They've sold 6 volumes. They sell 10, 20 million copies of each book. So that kind of thing too. So there's a whole range of literature. Nothing great in the way of Solzhenitsyn or Pasternak or the earlier writers from the earlier generations. The work done since the fall of the Soviet Union doesn't have the moral or the clarity or the depth or anything that the earlier work had, though. But it's being written all the time. And maybe something great will come out of it. But people seem to think that so far it doesn't compare.
John?
Yes.
George, there's a question from someone online. His name is John. In his book, Billington suggests that Orthodox Christianity and Islam would work well together. Could you comment on that?
Yes, certain sides of the Russian Orthodox religious figures would prefer to form an alliance with Islam than with Western Christianity. Part of this has to do with the group of thinkers that Billington talks about as the so-called Eurasianist. This is a movement that began in the 1920s in emigration, but was taken up again with the fall of the Soviet Union. And it's people who define Russia's position according to her geography. That is to say that Russia should mediate between the East and the West, between Europe and Asia, and that Russia's natural ally, traditionally going all the way back to prehistory, is Iran. That Russia is the continuation of ancient Iran. There's a whole school of thought that takes that up. And so that Russia's natural enemy or natural ally is the fellow continental power of Iran, ancient Persia, and Russia has taken over the position of ancient Persia. And so the cultural ties between Russia and Iran are reflected in the ties between Orthodoxy and Islam, Sufi Islam, or excuse me, between Russian Orthodoxy and the Islam in Shiite, the word I'm grappling for, the Shiite Islam, partly because Russian Orthodox see themselves as strictly moral in a way that the Western Church is not. They believe that the Western Church has become very decadent and that only the Russian Orthodox have remained true to the purity of ancient Christianity, just as the Shiites have remained true to the purity of ancient Islam, of early Islam. So this fundamentalist quality, in a way, or the very strict interpretation of the holy texts, and the stance toward the Western modern world is similar between Russian Orthodoxy and Shiite Islam. I know when I used to take groups to the Soviet Union, we would have to warn the girls when we went into we visited some monasteries and we went into churches, that they couldn't wear short skirts. They had to wear raincoats or something that would cover them up. Because once we made the mistake of going into one of the monasteries there near Moscow, and the monks actually came out and spat at the legs of the girls. They were so offended by it. And so this kind of very strict anti-Western, anti-modern behavior, seeing all of the West as being corrupt and decadent, is something that shares and that draws them together. Another factor is that the Russians want to remain close to the Islamic republics in Central Asia that used to be a part of the Soviet Union, the Uzbekistan, Turkestan, and those places. So they want to keep their alliance, and they do part of this through the church, the Orthodox Church, keeping ties with the Islamic people in Central Asia. So there is certainly ties, and the Russians prohibit the incursion of Western religions. They want to throw out the Baptists, the Mormons, and the Western Protestants. The Constitution of Russia now allows what they call the traditional religions, that is Orthodoxy, Judaism, and certainly Islam, but nothing very new, nothing that the Protestant religions they don't want, and certainly anything newer than that, the Mormons or anything like that, they want kick them out.
How do you see the rich philosophies of literature and history and science and math, etc., being able to be sustained such that Russia can influence its region in face of declining birth rates and lowering mortality?
That's a big problem. That's a problem that they all worry about, is that certainly the European Russians are declining, and the Central Asian areas and non-Russian peoples of Russia are certainly growing much faster. But they want to bring in, they want to, in fact, some of the people who are in the cosmos movement, who are writing essays, books, and so forth, are non-Russian people. It's interesting. And certainly in all the universities, you look at the names of the people who are contributing in all of these fields, and it is still a very diverse, ethnically diverse group of contributors. They write in Russian language, but they are from different ethnic and nationalities, different nationalities. So there is certainly, a sense of ethnic pride, ethnic division, and so forth, but not as bad as it was during the Brezhnev period, during the 1960s and 70s. At that time, it was really very bad, but now it has eased off quite a bit. And so the whole problem of maintaining a birth rate of all of Russia is a great problem. But they believe that still that it's not numbers and it's not quantity, but that they have a quality having to do with the soul and all of that is absent in the West. So that their contribution in the 21st and 22nd century will be one of quality, they say, rather more likely than one of quantity.
George, I'm going to reveal my ignorance here, but I was listening to you, and as David said, some of this seemed incredibly irrational.
Yeah.
I'm just going to throw something out and see what you think. I could see the attraction of this sort of worldview, which seems to basically, it's what is it? It's transcends normal human activity. And I could understand that when your whole world, the communist world, the whole ideology collapses. How do you make sense out of life, et cetera? However, a lot of the philosophers that you talked about were, pre-Soviet Union, or they had their period of influence in the early period. And I'm just wondering, to what extent is it appropriate to think about them in terms of trying to make sense out of a Russia that was somewhat of a failure in the sense that it was not keeping up with the West, even though the West was something to hold in disdain? You follow what I'm saying?
I think so. One way they look at it is that the Soviet period, communism itself, was a kind of religion and was a belief system rather than anything that was scientifically based. And so all through the Soviet period, the idea was that it's all kind of a fairy tale anyway. And that now it's almost as if they are substituting one imaginary framework for another imaginary framework. And one of the differences is that the imaginary framework that they are reaching toward is Russian, whereas the communist framework was non-Russian. And so they're going back to their roots, the roots of ancient Russia, actually, and trying to make some kind of framework of that. And also the Russians have, I think, going back as far as records show, have had a different orientation toward the world and toward themselves than has been the case in the West. And so there is a different mindset that tends to accept certain kinds of contradictions and paradoxes and irrationalities that we don't accept, and that we certainly, I think that must be taken into account too, that the irrationality of part of the Marxist system was something that they became aware of going through the late period, especially 70s and 80s, when you used to talk to people over there. They realized that it was pretty much a fiction, or at least a lot of the people did. And so it's not that they are leaving a scientific worldview in order to adopt a fictitious worldview, but they're moving from one fiction to another fiction, kind of. It's kind of strange. Yes, please.
George, I enjoyed your talk very much. Maybe it's me, but I thought they were sort of prescient in their thinking, because we talk about virtual reality. It doesn't seem so irrational to me what they were talking about. I think maybe some of the language and the way they saw it was different, but I think it may have been sort of visionary as to why.
It is. I think
Yeah.
so. That's how certainly how they view themselves, as visionaries.
Yeah.
And they don't care that the West rejects them. They're going to go their own way. And that's part of our way. Nash, our way, is we don't care what you think. This is our way, and we're gonna go that way.
And I was very intrigued by the title of your talk, The Russian Soul, and I wonder if you could just summarize, how would you characterize the Russian soul? If you could just tell us that.
It's an outdated term, frankly. In an academic conference of my fellow Russian specialists, they would be embarrassed to bring up the term the Russian soul, because it comes from the time of Chekhov and that whole period. But I think it's appropriate, partly because it's a term that has been used to describe what they feel is their essence, which is not their rationality. They believe generally that the human being is a composite of three basic parts: the mind, the soul, and the body. And so the strength of the Russians is what they call the soul, their empathy, their feeling function that they have toward the rest of life, toward their environment, toward their fellow human beings. That rationality is something that Germans do. But the Russians, that they have the great soul that nobody else has. in their own view. And it is this empathy with others, this sense of being able to identify with other people and with people of all kinds, to feel one with really all of your life, all of life and the environment. That's something that they consider special too. That it's as if they have these visible things coming out of them that that somehow can connect and touch with each other, and that's what they consider to be special. So that's their term of their idea of a country or a people with a highly developed soul, rather than a highly developed rational function or a highly developed physical function. It's the soul that allows them to endure things that other people can't endure, and allows them to accept things that other people wouldn't accept.
We have a question from New Haven, Connecticut, from Susanna.
From Susanna.
Okay. With the contradiction of Russia being fairly geographically isolated while having its foundation of totalitarian philosophy, is travel outside of Russia an important part of modern culture and education?
Certainly getting to be more of that. During the Soviet period, only people like Putin with connections to the KGB could travel abroad. The ordinary Russian person, number one, couldn't afford to, and two, could never get permission to travel abroad. Only through special connections could they travel either to the West or certainly to America. It was a real bonus for somebody to be able to go to Poland or Hungary or one of the other Eastern European countries within the Soviet orbit. Now, of course, it's getting much easier, and Russians can travel. If they can afford to travel, they can it's permissible for them to travel. So and that is so important, because in the 19th century, young, educated, or young aristocratic people from the noble families were able to travel and came back to Russia with ideas from the West that helped to change and helped to inform the dialogue and the discussion for the rest of the century. And then for the whole early 20th century, this was not possible. Now it is possible again, and not only for the very wealthiest or the highest social strata, but other people can come west too, to visit families. And so this connection between Russians and Europeans and Russians and Americans, and even Russians going to India and to Japan, this is really having a great effect now. And as soon as they were able to travel, they did. So it's something that they've looked forward to for a long time, and they're thoroughly enjoying it now, and it will certainly have a great effect on the future, I think, of Russia.
There's another question from Lee from New Hampshire. In this country, it's easy to see where young children are exposed to a culture of violence right from the get-go. In cartoons, where superheroes use violence to save the day, in video games, TV, music, stories, and fables, etc. Can you compare what a child in Russia might be exposed to, and is it being directed in any fashion as the country defines itself?
During the Soviet period, it was very tightly controlled. What they were exposed to and what they were not exposed to was very tightly controlled. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, then these controls certainly relaxed, and now children are exposed to all kinds of things. A terrible thing that they are exposed to is alcoholism. Alcoholism is a huge problem in today's Russia, as it was during the Soviet times and has been for centuries. But that kind of violence in the home, mainly because of alcohol, is one of the things that children are exposed to in their own families. In schools, I'm not that familiar with the literature that they read in schools now, or what they can and can't read or can and can't do in schools now. I just don't have a good sense of that. But I know that the young people walk around and look and act and talk in Russian, but listen to the same music that our teenagers do. They look like our teenagers, wear the same kind of clothes, have the same kinds of fashion, haircuts, and so forth. So today in Russia, especially in the big cities, it's hard to tell that you're actually in Russia and not anywhere in the modern world in some cases. It used to be that when you went over, you really noticed the differences between the Russian young people and our young people. They would look at the jeans that our kids were wearing, and they would want to buy them off them on the street, on the spot, so that they could have that look, because the Russian jeans just didn't look right, or the Russian shoes just didn't look right. But today, they're all the same, and the cars on the streets are the same. It's a culture. They are part of the international youth culture now that runs from Biddeford to Moscow or wherever, all over the world, that it's all the same at that level. Now, I don't know about at the younger levels, but certainly the teenagers are indistinguishable from those in our countries.
Well, maybe that was the last question, George. Thank you so much.
Thank you very
for a
much.
great evening.